My name is Zoya. I am 28 years old, and on the afternoon of August 12th, 2020, I walked into the crowded Riyadh marketplace knowing deep in my bones that something inside me was about to break. I had lived my whole life beneath layers of fabric, meant to hide every trace of who I really was. But that day, the air felt different, heavy, electric, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. The sun hung low above the sandstone rooftops, throwing molten gold across the marketplace, and I remember thinking that the light looked almost like a hand reaching for me. My own hands trembled inside my sleeves. Even now, I can still feel the trembling. Every sound around me felt amplified. Vendors shouting prices for spices and fruit, the sharp call of a child weaving between stalls, the rustle of abayas brushing against stone. Somewhere nearby, the call to prayer had just faded, leaving a haunting echo in the air. Dozens of women moved around me like shadows, silent, veiled, invisible, and for the first time in my life, I could no longer bear to be one of them. My heart pounded so loudly, I wondered if the people around me could hear it. I felt the blood rushing in my ears, a low roar like waves crashing in an unseen ocean. I kept walking until I reached the center of the marketplace where sunlight spilled across the ground in a perfect circle. It was there that I stopped. It was there that everything inside me rose like a storm breaking open. I lifted my hands. They were shaking uncontrollably, sweat gathering at my palms. For 1 second, one impossibly long second, I hesitated, hearing my father's voice in my mind. The voice of a king who believed obedience was the highest form of worship. Hearing the voices of every woman in my bloodline who bowed their heads and accepted silence as destiny. Hearing the warnings of religious teachers who promised that judgment awaited any woman who dared claim ownership of her own body. But beneath all of that noise, a quieter voice whispered something I had never heard in my life. This is not who you are. Before I could lose courage, I pulled the hijab from my head. The fabric slipped through my fingers and fell to the ground. And for the first time since childhood, sunlight touched my uncovered face. It felt like inhaling air after years underwater. Warm, pure, alive. My breath caught in my throat. I remember looking up at the sky and thinking, is this what freedom feels like? The world did not share my awe. It shattered. At first, there was stunned silence, a heartbeat of disbelief. Then came the shouting. A man near the fruit stall gasped loudly, pointing at me as if he had just witnessed a crime. 2 women covered their mouths in horror. Someone screamed the word haram so loudly it sliced through the crowd like a blade. The circle of people thickened around me, a tightening ring of outrage and accusation. I heard someone shout my name, Princess Zoya, and in that instant, recognition transformed the moment from scandal to catastrophe. Phones were raised, faces twisted with fury. A woman dared to stand uncovered. A royal woman dared to defy everything the kingdom declared sacred. I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs were paralyzed, my throat locked. My hands hung helplessly at my sides as 2 members of the religious police pushed through the crowd with faces carved from stone. They grabbed my arms, the metal of their grip cold even through my sleeves. My hijab was still lying in the dust behind me, like a snake I had shed. The officers dragged me through the marketplace as the crowd roared for punishment. I stumbled over stones, feeling every pair of eyes drilling into my back. Someone spat at my feet. Someone else shouted that apostates deserved death. I had heard these phrases my entire life, but never directed at me. The world around me blurred into a storm of noise and movement, yet inside I felt strangely calm, as if a quiet center had opened within the chaos. At the station, they chained my wrists to a metal ring bolted into the wall. The room smelled of sweat and rust. A bright fluorescent light hummed above me, harsh and unblinking. Officers questioned me, threatened me, accused me of betrayal. I said nothing. What could I say? Even I didn't fully understand why I had done it, only that I had reached the end of pretending. Hours later, the verdict came. Execution at dawn. I felt my whole body go cold, as if someone had drained the final drop of life from my veins. They led me to a solitary cell, the sound of my chains clinking softly with every step. And yet, as the door slammed shut behind me, drowning me in darkness, a strange thought entered my mind, gentle, persistent, impossible. This is not the end. I didn't know it then. But Jesus was already coming for me. I was born into a world built from marble, gold, and silence. From the outside, my childhood looked like a dream sculpted by wealth palace gates carved with verses, crystal chandeliers suspended like frozen stars, fountains whispering beneath arches of ivory stone. People often imagine that being a princess meant living in endless beauty, but beauty can be the most deceptive prison of all. My cage was not made of iron, it was made of luxury. The women's quarters where I grew up were a kingdom within a kingdom, a place where sunlight came filtered through carved lattice screens, and every doorway was guarded by rules older than memory. I can still see the rooms of my childhood. The silk cushions embroidered with gold thread, the carved wooden chests holding jewelry worth more than most people would see in their lifetime, and the endless shelves of religious books my tutors used to shape my understanding of the world. Everything around me gleamed, but nothing around me belonged to me. Even my thoughts felt monitored by invisible eyes. From the moment I could walk, I was taught that a girl must be soft-spoken, modest, obedient, 3 virtues that formed the bars of the invisible cell surrounding my life. I was told that purity was my crown, silence was my shield, and obedience was my path to divine approval. The first time a tutor wrapped a small scarf over my head, I remember her saying, "A jewel must always remain hidden." At 5 years old, I didn't understand what she meant. All I knew was that when the scarf covered my hair, the world became slightly darker. As I grew older, my religious education intensified. I memorized large portions of the Quran long before I understood their meaning, reciting verses in perfect rhythm while kneeling on Persian carpets worth more than a small village. The palace imams praised my devotion, saying I was the most obedient daughter my father could ask for. But my prayers felt like empty echoes swallowed by a ceiling too high and a God too distant. Every day I repeated words I didn't feel, hoping one day I would. I wanted to believe everything I was taught. I truly did. I wanted to love Allah with the same certainty I saw in the eyes of my teachers. But my heart remained restless, an aching hunger I didn't know how to name. At night, lying in my enormous bed surrounded by silk and marble, I sometimes wondered why God felt so far away, why He never seemed to look at me, even when I repeated His name until my voice trembled. I watched my brothers grow tall and strong, stepping freely through the palace gates while guards bowed to them. They traveled to London, Paris, Dubai, collecting stories and experiences like treasure. They spoke passionately about the world outside, about universities and careers and dreams they were allowed to chase. I loved them deeply, but each story they brought home was like a needle pressing into the delicate bubble of my reality. I, on the other hand, learned to sew, to serve tea gracefully, to lower my gaze at the right angle, and to smile without showing too much emotion. My world was a garden tended by others, carefully curated so that nothing unpredictable could grow. I was trained not to dream but to endure gracefully, to shine without drawing attention, to exist without being seen. There was one moment I will never forget, a moment that marked the first crack in the walls around my heart. I was 16 when I asked my mother, quietly, why women had to be hidden while men were allowed to exist in the full brightness of the world. She looked at me with a sadness I didn't understand then, a sadness heavy enough to make her shoulders slump just slightly. "Because this is how we stay safe," she whispered. "A woman's freedom brings danger. A woman's voice brings shame." Her answer sank into me like a stone falling into deep water. That was the night I realized the older women in our family were not peaceful, they were resigned. They weren't protected, they were confined. Their silence had not been chosen, it had been inherited. And I would inherit it too. That was also the age when I began noticing the contrasts within myself, the parts of me I was allowed to show and the parts of me I was forced to bury. The expected Zoya was graceful, polite, devout, unquestioning. But the hidden Zoya was something else entirely. Curious, restless, sensitive to injustice, hungry for meaning. The more I tried to silence that hidden version of myself, the louder she became. There were days I would stand by the latticed window of my room and watch dust swirl in the sunlight, imagining how it would feel to step outside without permission, without fear, without layers of fabric between me and the world. Sometimes I would dream of running barefoot across the palace courtyard, hair unbound, laughing just because I could. But dreams like that were dangerous. Dreams like that had no place in the life designed for me. I learned early that questions were unwelcome. When I cautiously asked why 2 women's testimony equals 1 man's, my tutor's face tightened, and she told me questioning the rules was like questioning God himself. When I asked why paradise seemed easier for men to enter than for women, she replied that women's very nature required additional restraint. Each answer confused me more, yet I buried my confusion to survive. But confusion has a way of growing quietly in the dark, and mine grew like a tree pushing through stone. Looking back now, I understand that the longing in me, the feeling that something was missing, the ache for a love I could not name was the whisper of a God I had not yet met. The God who would one day step into my darkest night and call me his daughter. The God I thought was far away but was closer to me than my own breath. That truth was still hidden then, buried under layers of tradition and expectation. But even in that palace of gold and silence, the first spark of awakening had begun. As I moved from adolescence into adulthood, the walls around my life did not merely remain, they grew taller. Expectations that once hovered quietly over my childhood became chains that tightened with every passing year. The palace was still beautiful, still glowing with gold and marble, but its beauty no longer disguised its purpose. It was not a home. It was a system designed to contain me. The shift began subtly. Conversations between elders grew more serious. Glances toward me lingered longer. And whispers floated through the women's quarters, phrases like suitable match, family alliance, preserving lineage. At 16, I barely understood the implications, but by 17, the truth landed heavily. I was not being prepared for a future. I was being prepared for an exchange. My father summoned me one evening to discuss prospects, men I had never met but whose names carried weight in the kingdom's political and economic spheres. Each suitor was described in terms of influence, power, and usefulness. I was not being offered a choice. I was being appraised. The realization settled into my chest like ice. I remember staring at my father's face as he spoke, wondering if he saw me at all or only the reflection of alliances he wished to create. His words flowed effortlessly, as if my future were already carved in stone and I needed only to walk into it without question. The part of me that had learned obedience nodded quietly, but the hidden Zoya, the one who had begun to awaken, shrank in terror. The older I grew, the more the restrictions multiplied. I could not travel, even within the city, without a male guardian. I could not attend school outside the palace. I could not speak to any man outside my bloodline without permission. Even my medical appointments required one of my brothers to stand in the room. My body, my voice, my choices, everything belonged to someone else. Yet the most suffocating restriction of all was the requirement to be grateful for these limits. Whenever I quietly asked why freedom was dangerous, I was told freedom corrupted women. Whenever I wondered why my brothers could choose their futures while mine was decided for me, I was told men bore the weight of responsibility women could not handle. And whenever I dared to question why God would design such inequality, I was told the design was sacred, unquestionable, divine. But deep inside, a different question pulsed in my heart. If God created me, why would he want me hidden? The moment everything began to change came unexpectedly. A young palace staff member mistakenly left a small digital device in my room, a thin tablet with unrestricted access to the outside world. The palace internet was normally filtered, monitored, and tightly controlled, but this device slipped through unnoticed. For weeks, I stared at it, terrified of the consequences if anyone discovered it in my possession. Yet I could not bring myself to return it. One night, unable to resist the growing curiosity within me, I switched it on. A universe opened. At first, I searched for harmless things, weather in other countries, landscapes I would never see, stories of people living lives beyond palace walls. But curiosity has its own instinct. Soon, I found myself reading about women's rights in other nations, and about cultures where a woman's voice was not a threat but a contribution. I felt something inside me crack, like a thin layer of ice breaking underfoot. Late one night, I typed a question that had lived silently in me for years. Why do women matter? The results led me down a path I could never have imagined. Articles, studies, and eventually testimonies written by women who had escaped oppression, fear, and religious systems that silenced them. Many of these testimonies were Christian. I did not know anything of Christianity beyond what I had been told growing up, that its scriptures were corrupted, its followers misguided, its God weak. But as I read story after story, something struck me deeply. These women spoke of Jesus not as a distant deity, but as someone who loved them personally. They described him as gentle, protective, compassionate, a man who defended women, spoke to them with respect, befriended them, healed them. Some even said he had appeared to them in dreams, calling them daughters. Daughters, not possessions, not bargaining chips, not sources of shame. The word lit a spark inside me. I began reading more carefully, deleting my history each time. I discovered that Jesus had spoken publicly with women, something unimaginable in my world. He had defended a woman about to be stoned. He had revealed profound truths to women before men. He had entrusted the first announcement of his resurrection to a woman, a detail that shocked me more than anything else. How could a prophet treat women with such dignity? And if this Jesus truly saw women the way these testimonies described, what would he think of me? Each night I read until my eyes burned. Part of me feared I was stepping onto forbidden ground, yet another part felt as if I were finally breathing after years of suffocation. The more I learned, the more impossible it became to ignore the contrast between the God I had grown up fearing and the Jesus I was discovering, Jesus who loved, who listened, who came close. But with every new truth I uncovered, the pressure inside me grew. My world expected obedience. My heart demanded freedom. My mind whispered questions. My soul whispered hope. And deep beneath everything, a storm was gathering, quiet, electric, inevitable. The breaking point was coming, and I could feel it approaching like a pulse beneath my skin. The months leading to August 12th felt like walking barefoot across glass, every step familiar, yet sharper than the one before. My days continued outwardly as they always had. Prayers at dawn, quiet meals with my mother and sisters, long hours of instruction, scripted conversations, and the constant presence of women who had learned to shrink themselves into silence. But inside me, something had begun to expand dangerously, uncontrollably, like a hidden fire searching for air. I tried to push down the questions that now rose daily, but they kept surfacing at the worst possible moments. During prayer, during meals, during forced smiles at family gatherings. Why must I be hidden? Why must my voice be softened into nothing? Why does God feel so far when I am told he is always watching? Why does the idea of Jesus linger in my mind long after I close the tablet, like a whisper I cannot unhear? The more I tried to bury these thoughts, the more they pressed against the edges of my mind until I felt I might crack. Some nights, lying awake on my vast bed in a room designed to look like paradise, I would place my hand on my chest just to feel my heart beating too fast, too anxious. I wondered if a heart could suffocate even with air filling the lungs. I wondered if a soul could drown without water. The night before everything changed, I felt something inside me shatter. It began quietly, no dramatic explosion, no sudden revelation, just exhaustion. a deep, bone-heavy exhaustion that no amount of sleep, prayer, or obedience could touch. I sat on the carpet of my room long after everyone had gone to bed, the dim light of a single lamp casting soft shadows across the walls. In that half-light, the palace looked like a museum of my life, rooms filled with objects that had nothing to do with who I truly was. My hijabs were neatly folded in drawers. My abayas hung perfectly ironed in a wardrobe. Shelves of religious books lined the walls like silent sentinels. I stared at them all, feeling strangely outside myself, as if I were watching another woman's life. Something is missing, I thought. Something is terribly wrong. And then came the realization I had been avoiding for years. I had never lived a single day as myself. Not one. The sentence hit me with the force of a blow. Tears rose without warning, spilling onto my hands. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to hold myself together, but the truth tore through me with brutal clarity. I was alive, yes, but I was not living. I was breathing, but I was not free. I existed in a world that saw me only as a body to be covered, a daughter to be controlled, a future wife to be exchanged. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of never living at all. Around midnight, I opened a drawer and took out a single sheet of paper. My hands were shaking as I wrote letters to my family, goodbye letters disguised as confessions. I told them I loved them. I told them I was sorry for being a disappointment. I told them that something in me was breaking and I didn't know how to fix it. I folded the letters neatly and tucked them beneath my pillow. The room felt too small. My skin felt too tight. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. I walked to the mirror and stared at my reflection, trying to recognize the woman staring back. All I saw was someone suffocating. In that suffocation, a single thought bloomed, the one I had been suppressing, fearing, ignoring. I cannot do this anymore. The next morning, I dressed as I always did, but something was different. My movements felt deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of a decision I had not yet admitted aloud. I wrapped my hijab around my head, smoothing the fabric, but my hands trembled. I looked at myself one last time in the mirror, committing the image to memory, Princess Zoya. Obedient, silent, invisible, a version of myself already fading. I went to the market with the women of my household as planned, blending into the sea of black fabric. The world outside the palace felt louder than usual, voices sharper, colors brighter, the sunlight more piercing. Every sound rang in my ears as though the universe was amplifying itself for this single moment. When we reached the center of the market, the same circular patch of light that I had stood in days before seemed to call to me. My heart raced, my fingers twitched. I felt the storm inside me surge. And then, without permission, without plan, without thought, I raised my hands. I felt the knot of fabric beneath my chin. I felt the air holding its breath. I felt the weight of every moment I had ever silenced myself. And I removed the hijab. The world erupted. But in that single second before the chaos, before the shouting, before the horror of what would come, I felt free, truly, terrifyingly free. And it was that moment of freedom that would lead me, unknowingly, directly into the arms of Jesus. The first night in the execution cell felt colder than any place I had ever known. Not because of the air, though it was damp and biting, but because of the silence. A terrifying kind of silence that pressed against my eardrums and sank into my bones. I sat on the concrete floor with my back against the wall, my wrists chained above me, and for a long time I simply stared into the darkness, unable to think, unable to breathe. The reality of my situation hovered above me like a shadow. By dawn, I would be dead. Fear should have consumed me. Panic should have overtaken me. Yet somewhere beneath my trembling breaths, another feeling lingered, something faint, something impossible. A whisper of presence. Not the presence of the guards outside the steel door, nor the memory of my family screaming my name in shock and shame earlier that day. This was something softer, something steady, something that felt strangely familiar even though I had never known it before. My mind drifted to the secret nights I had spent reading stories online, stories written by women who had once lived behind the same kind of walls I had lived behind. Women who felt unseen, unheard, unloved, women who had encountered someone called Jesus. I had read their testimonies in secret, thinking they were forbidden fantasies, stories too wild and beautiful to be true. They described him with such intimacy. A God who listened when they cried, a God who came close, a God who cared about their tears. I had never imagined a God could care about tears. My whole life, I had prayed to a God who felt far away, high above, unreachable behind layers of rules and expectations. But those women wrote about Jesus differently. They called him gentle. They called him healer. They called him friend. Most shocking of all, they called him Father. The word echoed through my mind now in the cell, wrapping itself around my heart like a warm thread. Father, a word I had never dared use in prayer, a word that felt almost blasphemous on my tongue, and yet I could not stop thinking of it. Somewhere deep inside, a spark flickered. Without planning to, without even knowing what I was doing, I whispered into the darkness, Jesus, are you real? The question broke something open in me. The moment the words left my mouth, tears streamed down my cheeks, not the frantic tears of panic, but the deep, aching tears of a soul calling out after years of silence. I did not know how to pray to him. I did not know what he expected. I did not even know if he could hear me. But the hunger inside me, the hunger for love, for freedom, for meaning, rose to the surface with a force I could no longer suppress. I took a shaky breath. My voice cracked as I whispered, if you are real, if you can hear me, please show me something. The cell remained silent. No lights flashed. No voices boomed from heaven. No miracles erupted in the air. But something inside me shifted, a subtle warmth blooming in my chest. Small but unmistakable, like the glow of a candle suddenly lit in a long abandoned room. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. Yet it was more real than anything I had felt in my 28 years of life. The warmth grew slowly, spreading through my ribs, up my throat, washing over my shaking hands. And with it came a peace I could not explain, a peace that made no sense in a cell where death waited on the other side of the door. My chains still cut into my wrists. My fate had not changed. And yet, for reasons beyond my understanding, I no longer felt alone. A verse I had read once returned to my mind like a whisper carried on a breeze. For God so loved the world. I didn't know the rest of the verse. I didn't understand its depth. But the first part stayed with me, lingering like a promise. God so loved. Not commanded, not demanded, not punished. Loved. Could such a God truly exist? I closed my eyes, letting the warmth settle into the hollow places inside me. The fear did not disappear, but it no longer controlled me. Something else, hope, fragile but alive, took its place. And in that silent, dark cell, with nothing left to cling to, I let the smallest seed of faith take root. The hours before dawn moved strangely slow and urgent at the same time, like the world was breathing differently. I sat curled against the wall, chains clinking softly whenever I shifted, my throat raw from silent crying. The concrete beneath me had grown colder, or maybe it was my body surrendering to the chill. Every so often, footsteps echoed down the hallway outside my cell, each one a reminder that time was running out. The guards were preparing for my execution. Somewhere in the building, officials were signing my final documents. My life, once protected by wealth and lineage, had been reduced to a line on a schedule. A part of me expected terror to consume me as the night wore on, but instead, a strange calm hovered over me, a calm I knew didn't come from myself. My earlier prayer lingered in the air like incense, impossible to take back. Jesus, if you are real, show me something. I didn't know what answer I expected, but the question had opened a door I could not close. Around 3 in the morning, something shifted subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The air in the cell felt heavier, as if the atmosphere were suddenly denser, saturated with something unseen. My skin prickled, the hairs on my arms lifted. The silence, once suffocating, now vibrated with a kind of hushed anticipation. Even the shadows on the walls seemed to stand still. I lifted my head. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Exhaustion, fear, and cold could easily play tricks on a dying woman's mind. But then the room began to fill with a soft, warm glow, one that did not come from the hallway or any light fixture. It seemed to rise from the air itself, blooming gently like dawn unfolding in miniature. The glow brightened, slowly, slowly, until the shape of the cell softened around me, as though the walls themselves were stepping back to make room for something holy. The light gathered in one corner of the room, growing brighter, warmer, richer, until my breath caught in my throat. I could feel my heart pounding, not in fear, but in awe, ancient, instinctive awe, the kind the soul remembers even when the mind does not. I blinked, unable to look away, and then, within the radiance, I saw him. He did not appear as an idea or a mist or some distant vision. He stepped forward with the weight and presence of someone undeniably real. He looked like no painting I had ever seen, no image on a foreign book cover. He belonged to my world. Middle Eastern features, strong and gentle, eyes shaped by sorrow and compassion, skin bronzed by desert sun. His robe moved with a softness I cannot explain, as though woven from light itself. His presence filled the space without force, without demand. It simply was overwhelming, undeniable, alive. And then he spoke my name, Zoya. I had never heard my name spoken like that. It carried neither judgment nor disappointment nor ownership. It carried tenderness, impossible tenderness, woven with an authority so profound it silenced every fear in me. His voice was deep yet gentle, resonant yet intimate, as if it were being spoken inside my chest rather than in the air. I tried to speak, but my mouth trembled without sound. Tears spilled before I even realized I was crying. I felt like a child, small and fragile, stripped of every defense I had ever built. Yet I felt no shame under his gaze. None. It was the first time in my life I had ever been looked at without feeling lesser. He stepped closer, and the warmth surrounding him wrapped around me like a blanket. My chains, cold and heavy seconds before, suddenly felt irrelevant. The cell no longer felt like a prison. The execution no longer felt like the end. Every breath seemed to expand my chest with a new kind of life, a life I had never known was possible. "You were never meant to be hidden," he said. The words shattered something in me. I sobbed loud, uncontrolled, the kind of sobbing that comes from the deepest, buried parts of the soul. All my life I had been covered, silenced, reduced, taught to disappear. And here stood a man, a holy man, a divine man telling me I was meant to be seen. Nothing had ever pierced me so completely. "You are my daughter, not a servant, not a mistake, not a shame, not a possession, a daughter." The word enveloped me like fire, like healing water. I didn't understand how this could be true, how he could claim me with such certainty, but my heart knew before my mind did. It recognized his voice the way a newborn recognizes the voice of its mother, instinctively, intimately, unexplainably. He knelt before me not as a king towering above his subject, but as someone coming down to lift me from the ground. His eyes held mine, and in them I saw something I had never experienced. Unconditional love, fierce and gentle, eternal. "I have seen every moment of your pain," he said softly. "Every tear, every whisper, every time you felt alone. You were never alone." A warmth shot through me, through my spine, my ribs, my fingertips, as though he were stitching together every broken piece inside me. Memories flashed, moments of silence, of humiliation, of longing, and with each memory came healing, like light filling cracks long hidden in darkness. Your story, he continued, will not end tomorrow. I gasped. My heart stumbled. Hope, wild, impossible hope, filled my lungs until I could barely breathe. I am making a way. As he spoke, the chains around my wrists loosened, not physically, but spiritually, as if their power had dissolved. The fear of death, the shame of my upbringing, the weight of years spent unseen, all of it lifted. For the first time in my life, I felt fully, undeniably alive. Then, slowly, the light around him began to soften, as if he were stepping back into a world beyond my sight. Panic rose in me, but he held up his hand, calming, reassuring. I am with you, he said, even when you cannot see me. And then the light faded. The cell returned. The darkness returned. The chains remained, but I was no longer the same woman. I had met Jesus, and nothing, not death, not prison, not the world itself could ever take that from me. When the vision faded and the cell returned to darkness, I half expected fear to surge back into me like a rising tide. But instead, a strange weightlessness filled my chest. The chains still cut into my wrists. The concrete was still biting cold beneath me. And dawn was still drawing near, but none of it felt the same. I kept replaying his voice in my mind, the way he said my daughter, the way his presence wrapped around me like a warmth I had never known. It was as if something woven into the fabric of my being had been rewritten. Minutes or maybe hours passed in a blur. My sense of time dissolved. I only knew that at some point I drifted to sleep, not from exhaustion, but from peace. When I opened my eyes again, a faint gray light was seeping under the bottom edge of the cell door. Dawn, my execution time. Yet instead of terror, a quiet certainty settled into me. My story will not end today. Jesus had said so himself. And the words of a king might be overturned, the words of judges might be rewritten, but the words of the Son of God could not fail. I lifted my head, waiting, listening. Any moment, the guards would come. Any moment, they would drag me to the courtyard. But the hallway was full of noise, voices, hurried footsteps, doors slamming. Not the orderly rhythm of an execution morning. This was chaos. Something was wrong, or perhaps something was right. 2 guards ran past my cell, speaking in hushed, frantic tones. I couldn't make out everything they said, but the fragments sent a tremor through me. International press, leaked documents, orders from the palace. Execution postponed. Postponed. The word struck me like a bolt of lightning. My breath caught. I pressed myself closer to the door, straining to hear more, hardly daring to believe what my ears were telling me. Another guard ran down the hall, clutching a stack of papers. "We can't proceed," he barked. "There's been an intervention. They're questioning the legitimacy of the ruling. Higher authorities are reviewing it." Higher authorities. Reviewing. Intervention. Jesus had said he was making a way. A wave of astonishment washed over me. So intense, I felt dizzy. My knees gave out and I sank onto the floor, tears spilling down my face. Not tears of fear this time, but of awe. I didn't know how, I didn't know through whom, but God was moving swiftly, powerfully, unmistakably. Within an hour, my execution was officially suspended. By mid-morning, a new order arrived. My sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. I should have felt crushed, all hope of freedom ripped away. But I wasn't crushed. I knew deep in my bones that this was only the first step of a much greater deliverance. They moved me to a different wing of the prison, a section reserved for political and religious offenders. The cell was larger, but still barren, stone walls, iron bars, a single thin mattress. And yet, as I entered that space, I felt an indescribable peace settle over me, as if Jesus himself had walked beside me into the room. Days passed, then weeks, then months. My father never visited. No one from the royal family came. not even my mother. In the eyes of the kingdom, I was no longer a daughter, I was a disgrace, a traitor, a warning. But in the eyes of God, I was His. And that identity became the anchor that held me through the long stretches of silence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a hidden world revealed itself inside the prison. On my third week, a woman in the laundry area slipped a folded piece of cloth into my hand. Inside, it was a tiny scrap of paper with a handwritten verse. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted." I stared at the words in disbelief. She met my eyes for a brief second, a spark of recognition, of shared faith before turning away. I was not alone. There were other Christian women here, some imprisoned for possessing a Bible, some for refusing to pray in the prescribed way, some for sharing their faith with relatives who turned them in. They gathered in shadows, prayed in whispers, worshipped in silence. Over time, they found me, or perhaps God guided them to me. We met in secret corners in the laundry room, in the dim hallway outside the showers, in the courtyard when guards grew careless. Their faces were thin, their bodies bruised, but their eyes burned with a fierce light I had never seen among the wealthy women of my former life. These women had nothing, no status, no protection, no freedom. Yet they had Jesus, and Jesus was enough. They taught me to pray not as a ritual, but as a conversation. They taught me to worship not with songs, but with surrender. They taught me to hope not in circumstances, but in Christ alone. The Holy Spirit moved among us like a secret wind, unseen but undeniable. We experienced small miracles, a guard turning away at just the right moment, a missing meal replaced unexpectedly, a confiscated note miraculously returned. Every blessing, every escape from danger felt like a whisper from God. I am here. 3 years passed this way. Years that should have broken me, but instead rebuilt me. The old Zoya, the silent princess, the obedient daughter of a kingdom that never saw her faded like a shadow at sunrise. In her place stood a woman I had never imagined I could become. Bold, free, unashamed, alive. Then, in March 2023, everything changed again. The warden summoned me unexpectedly. His face was unreadable as he handed me a document with a government seal. I read it once, twice, 3 times, unable to comprehend the words. By order of diplomatic negotiation and humanitarian agreement, it declared, prisoner Zoya is to be released and transferred out of the country immediately. Released, transferred, free. My knees trembled. My vision blurred. Jesus had finished what he promised in that cell 3 years earlier. He had made a way through governments, through international pressure, through impossibilities stacked higher than walls of stone. That night, as I boarded a plane under escort, leaving behind the land of my birth, the land of my suffering, I pressed my forehead against the window. The desert spread below me, vast, ancient, silent. The place where my story began, but not where it would end. The engines roared to life, lifting me into a future I could not imagine. And as the lights of Riyadh disappeared beneath the clouds, I whispered the only words that made sense. Thank you, Jesus. You saved me. When the plane touched down in Switzerland, I felt as if my soul had arrived before my body. The air smelled different, cleaner, freer, as though every breath I took was a baptism of its own. I stepped onto the tarmac with trembling legs, realizing that for the first time in my life, there were no guards watching me, no rules dictating my steps, no veil hiding my face. I was simply myself, Zoya, a woman no longer defined by fear. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and resettlement procedures, but through it all, a thread of astonishing peace held me together. I had expected grief to overwhelm me, grief for my family, my culture, the life I had lost, but what surprised me was the overwhelming sense of being held. It felt as though an invisible hand guided me, comforting me, reminding me that freedom always comes with both loss and resurrection. It was my baptism that sealed everything. Standing waist deep in the icy waters of Lake Geneva, I shivered as wind rippled across the surface. A small group of believers surrounded me, faces warm with the kind of love I once believed impossible. When the pastor asked if I accepted Jesus as my savior, my voice cracked, but I spoke with a clarity that felt carved from the core of my being. Yes, with all my heart. As I went under the water, I felt the weight of my old life, the palace walls, the silence of the women's quarters, the suffocating expectations break into pieces. When I rose again, gasping from the cold, I was laughing and crying at the same time. Not because the water was freezing, but because something inside me had finally thawed. I was no longer the princess of a kingdom that did not know me. I was the daughter of a king who loved me enough to step into a prison cell and call me his own. Life since then has not been perfect. I carry scars, emotional, spiritual, invisible, that still ache on quiet nights. I miss my mother's voice. I miss my sister's laughter. Sometimes I miss the familiar cadence of my homeland's call to prayer echoing across the desert. But even in those moments of longing, Jesus meets me with a tenderness that steadies my heart. I know he is writing a story far greater than anything I left behind. If you are listening to my story right now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt trapped by expectations, by fear, by the weight of a life that doesn't feel like your own? Have you ever felt unseen, unheard, or forgotten? I lived most of my life in that darkness, believing no one could reach me. But Jesus found me where no one else could. In a cell where death waited, he called me daughter. He can do the same for you. No prison, physical or emotional, can keep him out. No shame is too deep for his love to heal. No life is too broken for him to restore. If you need prayer, if you feel lost, or if something in the story stirred your heart, share where you're watching from. You're not alone. And if you want to hear more testimonies of how Jesus is still saving, still healing, still rewriting stories, make sure to subscribe. Because my story is just one of countless others. And maybe yours is next.